Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm John OLoughin. Welcome to McDuff Lives. And it's Monday morning, November 13th, 2023. And we are continuing our selected readings from the book, The Paperclip Conspiracy by Tom Bauer, The Hunt for the Nazi Scientists. And I am, in regard to the first chapter that we read, chapter and a half, the takeaways are that we ended up with Dr. Hubertus Strughold, an arrogant but clever Westphalian, the pioneering the medical team that carried out the basic research behind the equipment that allowed Neil Armstrong to survive the uh, the astronaut flights, etc. And for these Germans, this was confirmation of the supremacy of German science. The In the lifespan of the Third Reich, von Braun, Strughold, and 20,000 German scientists had revolutionized the weapons of warfare. And the next couple of chapters are basically demonstrating how the armies and navies and budding Air Force power, if there was one, in the Western powers, and especially Britain and America, was still not honored in terms of the power that this new technology could bring. And so they thought, well, we're just going to continue on our basic plan of big battleships and infantry and not worry about tanks so much or aircraft. And so this is the superiority of German warfare equipment that has been demonstrated over and over again. And they went through things like the Battle of Britain, uh, things that the Blitz, of course. The trouble that they had was they were just not able to convince the people that held the purse strings that they really needed to innovate, and so they didn't. Well, I'm going to pick up the story on page 49 in the chapter called Unpleasant Realities. I'd say the first couple chapters, the one that I would think is the most telling is the one called Imperial Delusion. And while it's really about the British Empire and its delusion that, of course, we always win, we are the greatest, that delusion also reflects the imperial attitudes of the militaries, including the United States. The Navy is very much of an imperial attitude, and so does the Army. And so these entrenched, Napoleon type figures are not interested in giving into some technology that they probably will never be able to understand themselves. Okay, page 49 at the bottom. 8 months later, this is after the disaster in Tunisia, where the American Sherman tanks were completely outclassed by the German tanks, the Tiger tanks. Excuse me a second. I guess it's always better to be able to hear yourself. So we're still in kind of the preparatory stages to the story of Paperclip, but we start to encounter these names that are going to come back. One of them is Henry Tizard, and you'll hear some more as we keep reading. Okay, 8 months later, on September 11th, 1943, Britain conceded victory to German industry and its engineers. After months of perpetual changes of policy about the future of tank design, J.F. Everts, the ACIGS, recommended to Grigg that the British effectively cease building tanks, blaming, quote, the rapid advance made by Germany in a remarkably short space of time. Our advance has been slow, and by the time that the weapon is in the hands of the troops, it has been outclassed by that possessed by the enemy. I feel that the time has now come when we must certainly face the fact that Britain British cruiser tank design and production has failed, both in quality and in the time factor. Prestige is irrelevant. The troops must have battle-worthy tanks." Unquote. Britain would build railway carriages instead, turning to America for her tanks. This is a big deal, right? All of a sudden, America becomes the industrial power that fuels the war. Britain would build railway carriages instead, turning to America for her tanks, and her reliance on the United States would create a competitor rather than an ally in the race to seize German secrets. Henry Tizard had been among the few at the outbreak of the war to realize that Britain, unable to narrow the enormous industrial and technological lead that Germany enjoyed, would need American help. Few others in Whitehall shared his unpatriotic gloom. The service chiefs had viewed Tizard's proposed Anglo-American cooperation with the same distrust with which they had rejected his suggestion of employing civilian scientists. The Americans, they felt, had nothing to offer for future weapons development and could definitely not be trusted with military secrets. Isn't that something to think about? These are the top generals and admirals of the British services saying, don't trust the Americans. Meanwhile, other voices are being heard in Whitehall. When René Studler, the U.S. military attaché in London, had asked the War Office before the war for permission to inspect a British tank, he had been firmly told that foreigners were never allowed inside a British armored vehicle. Little changed when war was declared. Exchange of scientific secrets remained unthinkable. Just after the invasion of France, Professor Archibald Hill had been sent to Washington as temporary scientific attaché with the uncompromising brief that Britain would not divulge any secrets. Doesn't seem right, does it? It's like that's a world that existed before we learned about, William Stevenson and uh, all of that stuff. This is before that. And we're getting a view that comes from the old traditional, elites and the Army and Navy. Shortly before Dunkirk, the policy changed. An intelligence appreciation blandly entitled, quote, "British strategy in a certain eventuality," unquote, described the government's options in the event of France's defeat. Britain's survival, it concluded, depended upon American minerals, foodstuffs, machinery, ships, and a vast range of weapons, quote, "without which we do not consider we could continue the war with any chance of success," unquote. This judgment was confirmed a few weeks later. In the last 10 days of July 1940, 11 British destroyers were sunk or badly damaged. Britain appealed to America for salvation. This, quote, "destroyers are frightfully vulnerable to air bombing," unquote, Churchill telegraphed Roosevelt, implicitly condemning the Admiralty's peacetime folly. To save Britain, in return for 50 obsolete American destroyers, Churchill offered the president bases on British territory. As an enticement, he also offered the American Navy the secret of Aztec, which was part of a wilder invitation to exchange information that he hoped would dispel any mistrust in Washington and set the seal on his proposal of total cooperation. So this is Churchill's idea, total cooperation, completely against the generals. Okay, sorry, I lost my place. As an enticement, he also offered the American Navy the secrets of Aztec, which was part of a wilder invitation to exchange information that he hoped would dispel any mistrust in Washington and set the seal on his proposal of total cooperation. Roosevelt approved Churchill's package, and Tizard was selected to mastermind the disclosure of Britain's complete accumulation of scientific secrets. In the boxes and crates that accompanied the British scientists to Washington were prototypes and blueprints for power-driven aircraft turrets, anti-submarine and anti-aircraft weapons, a proximity fuse, a cavity magnetron valve that would revolutionize the use of radar for the remainder of the war, and a set of designs for the Rolls-Royce Merlin aircraft engine, which would transform the sluggish Mustang into an excellent fighter. Most important of all, the group brought a complete summary of British atomic research. Quote, in the early days of scientific exchange, unquote, wrote John Burchard, a senior scientific director on the American National Development Research Committee, that's the NDRC, which we've talked about a lot with David and others, David Cranmer Underdown, that is. The British gave more than they received, unquote. The British team was greeted by, I need a drum roll button. Okay, you're going to love this. The British team was greeted by Vannevar Bush, an inventor and engineer recently appointed chairman of the new National Defense Research Committee by Roosevelt. Like Cherwell, and Cherwell has been introduced earlier, he is Lindemann, the chemist and engineer that becomes a close friend of Churchill's, also known as Lord Cherwell. All right. Like Cherwell, Bush was talented, irascible, and arrogant. But unlike Cherwell, he soon commanded a large, well-funded organization that occasionally wielded decisive influence. The NDRC had been created on Professor Hill's advice that the supervision of a new weapons development must be entrusted to a civilian organization of scientists and engineers. A year later, when the new and more powerful Office of Scientific Research and Development, the OSRD, was created with Bush as its director, the Cape Cod Yankee increased his power by stipulating that he be granted direct access to the president. Around him, he gathered a group of enthusiastic scientists and engineers who were willingly convinced by Tizard's team that warfare depended upon science and needed no persuasion that their efficacy depended upon strictly preserving their independence from the military. Okay, another drum roll coming. To guarantee that independence, Dr. James Conant was sent to London as Bush's ambassador to head a growing NDRC liaison and research group. Tizard's mission had laid the foundation of the intense and extraordinarily uninhibited Anglo-American wartime cooperation, which later spread to the investigation of German technical advances. Under Bush's influence, the American military would eventually develop a huge appetite for German scientific secrets. But the prelude was inauspiciously slow. In 1940, Bush faced the same problems as Tizard and Cherwell, the peacetime legacy of the military's lack of interest in scientific innovations, not least in the Navy. There had been a limited Anglo-American exchange of naval intelligence before 1940, but the British had judged that the United States had very little to offer. The American Navy, in Bush's view, was infected by stubbornness. Quote, all decisions were made by a top brass, old-fashioned technically. Decisions once made were not reviewed, were not even commented upon by anyone whatever. Admiral Ernest King had silently watched the Japanese Air Force effortlessly sink the battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, the pride of the Royal Navy, off Singapore in the autumn of 1941 because the Admiralty had waved aside the provision of aircraft protection and insisted that the ship's own guns were sufficient. King would expose the American fleet at Pearl Harbor to the same danger. Admiral King's, quote, conservatism, unquote, as Bush soon discovered, also prescribed that the U.S. Navy would rely on discredited depth charges and sonar, similar to ASDIC, to avoid and hunt for submarines. Bush's early attempts to convert King to the wonders of radar foundered on, in Bush's words, the admiral's, quote, antediluvian conviction that convoying was the only way to combat the submarine. There never was a clearer example of the tendency to fight a war with the weapons and tactics of the preceding war. King had no grasp whatsoever of the technical revolution which had occurred, unquote. Despite the sinking in 1942 of 1,664 Allied ships totaling nearly 8 million tons at a cost of only 82 U-boats, traditional seafarers were slow to grasp that technical innovation had swept aside many of the Navy's historical preconceptions. It was the same blinkered obstructionism that, until 1943, blocked cooperation among the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff to create an effective airborne coastal command capable of sinking the U-boats that were attacking Allied shipping along with, with impunity, just a short distance from the American coastline. If you've ever studied this, you can see all along the coast, both in the East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. You can see where all of these German submarines they're still there. They're sunk down. They got sunk. But also, if you find the right map, you can see the map of all of the American ships that got sunk by those submarines before the submarines were sunk. And it was a terrific, terrific loss. I mean, imagine, the merchant sailors that were just drowned, thousands of ships, 1,664 ships in one year. So, reluctant and handicapped, the American Navy was only gradually drawn by the Royal Navy into the frenzied clash of technology that constantly tilted the balance between the combatants in the Atlantic. As the lessons accumulated, both Allied navies' respect for German scientific skills increased enormously. Germany's declaration of war against America and the abortive invasion of Russia had forced Hitler at the beginning of 1942 to change his strategy from a short to a long-term war. Grand Admiral Karl Dönnitz's submarine designers began a crash program that pushed technical frontiers far beyond anything envisioned 2 years earlier. New U-boats were designed to dive to 600 feet, a specification that the Admiralty found incredible since British designers were unable to produce anything similar. Special supply submarines, milk cows, quote unquote, which could replenish the U-boats at sea, were sent out into the Atlantic, permitting the packs to sustain longer operations and saving them the perilous return journey to European ports. In Kiel, the Waltewerke began building a submarine powered by a mixture of fuel and hydrogen peroxide that did not need to surface for long periods to replenish its batteries. And for attack, the U-boats were equipped with acoustic and zigzag homing torpedoes, as well as an improved magnetic torpedo pistol. Against that arsenal, the Allies sent long-range Liberator aircraft equipped with shortwave 10-centimeter radar, high-frequency direction-finding equipment, new and more powerful air depth charges correctly tuned to explode at varying depths, and Lee searchlights, hoping they would halt the submarine offensive. The location of the decisive clash of technologies was at the, quote, Greenland air gap, unquote, an area beyond the reach of earlier Allied aircraft. Pardon me. During the first week of May 1943, 60 U-boats had grouped north of the Azores to attack convoy ONS-5. Considering the fate of its predecessors, the convoy had only a slim chance of an unscathed passage across the Atlantic. During the first 20 days of March 1943, and think about it, this is March 1943 when my dad has graduated from the U.S. Navy Reserve Midshipman School at Columbia on February the 15th, and has now been sent to Washington to get additional training in fire control, bomb disposal, and photographic analysis. And it's March of 1943. The U-boats are now having a showdown with the American Navy. Considering the fate of its predecessors, the convoy had only a slim chance of an unscathed passage across the Atlantic. During the first 20 days of March 1943, 97 Allied ships had been lost, totaling more than 500,000 tons, a crippling loss that, if continued, would have been fatal to Britain. Convoy ONS-5's survival depended upon the new technology. As predicted, the U-boats attacked, sinking 12 merchant ships. But in return, 7 U-boats were destroyed. By the end of the month, in a series of further attacks and counterattacks, a total of 33 U-boats had been sunk. Heeding the high losses, Dönitz, already suffering from Hitler's capricious interference and the backlash of the reverses on the Russian front, temporarily withdrew his packs from the battle. Allied losses plunged while a total of 237 U-boats were destroyed. At the end of 1943, German naval intelligence appointed highly qualified scientists to investigate the cause of such unprecedented destruction. Quote, "It was 10-centimeter radar, which caused all the German losses," unquote, Dönitz admitted to Hitler. On January 2nd, 1944, the British intercepted a message from Hitler to U-boat crews. German losses, the Fuhrer explained, were due to, quote, "a single technical invention of our enemies," unquote. Convoy ONS-5's survival had been won purely by technology, and the victory whetted the appetite of Allied naval staff for more information about German technological ideas. In the aftermath of the Tizard mission, the U.S. Air Force entered the war with more robust confidence than the Army or the Navy. When General Hap Arnold, the genial U.S. Deputy Chief of Staff and Commanding General of the U.S. Army Air Force, visited Britain in April 1941, he noted that the British were undisputably amiable and brave, but also inefficient. His hosts had insisted that it was impossible to conduct precision daylight bombing over Germany safely because, with existing bomb sites, a 20-second run was needed for proper aim. Unsinged by combat over Germany, Arnold was skeptical of British trepidation. Daylight bombing, he was convinced, was possible with the 4-engined high-altitude Flying Fortress, with its pressurized cockpit and daylight bomb sight. But the British did have something to offer. At Tizard's suggestion, Arnold had seen the first jet engines designed by Frank Whittle. The RAF, Arnold was told, possessed 3 jet propulsion planes, one ready to fly, one with the engine on a test bed, and a third ready for installation. But production was in utter disarray. Dismayed by lack of progress, Whittle entrusted Arnold with his priceless blueprints for the jet engine and encouraged him to allow American industry to pioneer its development. Arnold returned to Washington, gripped by the technical duel with Germany. For Arnold and General Ira Eaker, that's E-A-K-E-R, the commander of the U.S. 8th Air Force in Britain, the intensive bombing of Hamburg started on July 24, 1942. Would confirm the preeminence of American technology as epitomized in the Flying Fortress. Together with Bomber Command, the U.S. Air Force set out on the first of 3,095 sorties over 4 days that engulfed the whole city in a massive firestorm. sending a temporary shudder through the Nazi hierarchy. Quote, Hamburg put the fear of God into me, unquote, confessed Albert Speer. The cost to the Allied air forces, just 12 bombers, was minimal because the German radar system had been wondrously confused by, quote, window, unquote, hundreds of thousands of strips of tinfoil, calculatingly dropped before the bombers appeared on the screens of Freya network. To Harris and Eaker, their bombers suddenly seemed invulnerable. Eaker's bombers were now aggressively poised for an all-American attempt to sever Germany's jugular. The target on August 17th was the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt. Now, who hasn't seen some report or movie about the attack on Schweinfurt? Very interesting stuff. All right. Since the Hamburg raid, German technicians had, with considerable resourcefulness, produced radar that could distinguish between the window tinfoil and the bombers. And waiting to swarm for the kill were squadrons of new FW-190 fighters armed with revolutionary 21-centimeter rockets. In the ensuing melee, only 30% of the target factories were destroyed, and no fewer than 60 of the 376 flying fortresses with their crews were lost. This was, in the official history, quote, a crippling disaster, unquote, augmented by, quote, a high tide of tribulation. During a second equally disastrous raid in October. It was a bitter blow for Eaker and the U.S. Air Force, inducing new fascination for the adversary's technical talents. Moreover, news of the 8th Air Force's defeat arrived in London at the same time as startling confirmation that, while the Luftwaffe was about to commit jet fighters to the battle over Germany, the prospects for British and American jets were languishing. Churchill was agitated. Quote, we cannot afford, we cannot afford, he minuted, to be left behind. So he just wrote it. The first hint of the Germans' development of jet aircraft was a chance sighting on July 25, 1942, by an alert Mosquito crewman who had photographed an unusual Luftwaffe fighter. Over the following 9 months, AI-2 subsection G gathered sufficient evidence to confirm the flight of the world's first jet fighter, the Me-262. The sighting occurred just 7 days after its maiden flight, delayed by 2 years when Hitler and Goering had ordered that further production should be halted in favor of bombers. For the Allies, it was a lucky decision, since Germany was at least 4 years ahead of Britain and America. The maiden flight of the world's first turbojet aircraft, the Heinkel 178, on August 27, 1939, had passed off relatively unnoticed. Dr. Hans von OLoughin, the jet engine designer, had beaten Frank Whittle by 2 years because he had chosen hydrogen as his experimental fuel. Von OLoughin had also profited from greater interest and financial support from German industry. Although Whittle had designed the first jet engine in 1919, he had suffered 20 years of prejudice and bankruptcy until, on the eve of the war, David Pye, the Air Ministry's Director of Scientific Research, agreed to state-sponsored development. But the promise of support for Whittle's engine did not include support for a suitable aircraft. At the end of 1940, the Secretary of State for Air wrote to Lord Beaverbrook urging the construction of a jet plane, the Meteor, but received no reply. Then, in July 1941, Churchill ordered Beaverbrook to investigate the lack of progress, which resulted in an immediate order for 300 Meteors. Gloucester's, the manufacturer, was urged to improve its design, but at the end of 1942, when he was shown the improvements, Air Staff Chief Sir Charles Portal realized that Gloucester's had failed, and he reduced the order to just 50 aircraft. To make matters worse, by 1943, production of Whittle's jet engine at the Rover factory was, according to an unofficial report, in a chaotic condition. and production had to be transferred to Rolls-Royce. Whittle's depression was somewhat relieved by a visit to the General Electric factory in America. General Electric had been given the British blueprints by General Arnold since both Lockheed and Bell were finding difficulties in producing a suitable plane. The corporation's plan in 1942 was to produce 1,000 jets per month. American designers, like their British counterparts, lacked the wind tunnels and aerodynamic design skills to produce a shape that would allow the jets to power the airframe to faster speeds, whereas German designers had found the answer, the swept wing. The experimental Me-163 rocket plane could fly a remarkable 623 miles per hour, while the aluminum alloy Me-262 flew at 540 miles an hour. At best, the Meteor, without swept wings, could reach only 480 miles per hour, and a series of American experimental planes failed to even match the Meteor. Churchill, suspecting that the air chiefs were complacent, impatiently commissioned his son-in-law, Duncan Sandys, that's Sandys, to investigate. Sandys could be guaranteed, the Prime Minister felt, to submit an independent assessment. The combined chiefs in Washington had already concluded that, quote, if German fighters are materially increased in numbers, it is quite conceivable that this would make our daylight bombing unprofitable and perhaps our night bombing too. An air intelligence report to the cabinet confirmed German technical superiority. Jets would certainly destroy any Allied hopes for air supremacy. Sandys's draft report for Churchill was ready in September. It was doom-laden. Quote, the enemy is appreciably ahead of us in the development of jet-propelled aircraft of all the more advanced types. The possibility cannot, in my opinion, be excluded that towards the end of 1944 and during 1945, the Germans may be in a position to put into service, in small numbers, both fighters and bombers of higher performance than those which we will then have available, unquote. The report recommended that Britain and America boost their own development work and use technical intelligence agents to discover German methods, both from Germany and, quote, as soon as Italy collapses, unquote, from the Campini Caproni works. Portal automatically intercepted Sandys's report. Supported by Air Vice Chief Marshal Sir Wilfred Freeman at the Ministry of Aircraft Production, Portal hoped the report could be suppressed. In an, quote, official letter, unquote, on September 6th to Portal, Freeman wrote, quote, we must be careful to avoid exciting the uninitiated about this sort of thing, unquote. On the same day, Freeman also wrote unofficially, unquote, at greater length, I am seriously concerned about the possibility that we may squander a disproportionate amount of effort on projects which can have no bearing on the course of the present war. We have got to keep technically ahead of the enemy, but it is one jump ahead that we want to keep. And one is in all capital letters. Considering Britain's strained resources, Freeman's argument had considerable merit, but it assumed that the scientific development could be turned on and off as military needs arose. In autumn 1943, for Freeman, jet aircraft existed only, quote, on a remote and nebulous horizon, unquote, and were still comparatively unimportant. Portal agreed and successfully convinced Sandys not only to exclude from his report any adverse comment on Britain's languishing jet development, but also to recommend that responsibility for further investigation be transferred to the Air Ministry. Sandys's official sanitized report concluded that while German jet development had made progress, quote, there will be many problems to solve before they can be regarded as a serious operational threat, unquote. Pardon me again. Shortly afterward, Freeman's self-satisfied assurance, based on the belief that British scientists could always, when necessary, match the Germans, was violently shaken. In September, reports from the Bay of Biscay described a successful German attack on a British ship using a radio-guided rocket missile. Launched from a plane, the HS-293 was guided by the aircrew to the target. A later report from Italy told of a new powerful German bomb, the PC-1400FX, which was also radio-guided. Surprised by the apparent lack of any advanced warning, the Director of Naval Intelligence reviewed previous intercepts and interrogations. To his discomfort, he discovered that relevant messages had been deciphered but ignored because the members of the intelligence staff were not scientists and simply could not understand their importance. Overnight, it seemed that the Allied fleet was at risk because of the failure of scientific intelligence. The Admiralty immediately established a scientific intelligence section, NID 78, to cooperate with the Air Ministry's AI2G. Such a palliative might have satisfied Portal and Freeman, but not the Prime Minister. Despite Portal and Freeman's suppression, Sandys privately communicated to Churchill the substance of his fears. On October 6th, the Prime Minister sent Portal an unequivocal command, quote, "Recent evidence shows that the Germans are working hard on jet-propelled aircraft and accentuates the need for the utmost pressure to be put on their development here," unquote. When the Defense Committee operations met on October 25th, Sandys's warnings of German supremacy had been reinstated, but to little effect. To satisfy Churchill, Freeman proposed a new development team, a maximum of 100 men who would be detached for 6 months. In comparison, Messerschmitt's development team numbered 1,400. By the end of 1943, the superiority of German equipment and the resilience of German industry were acknowledged by Allied intelligence. Yet even those admissions were based on astonishing underestimates of German production. In adversity, German industrialists, engineers, and scientists were constantly innovating and producing superior weapons, and the Ministry of Economic Warfare's enemy branch conceded that Germany was still turning out armaments, quote, on an exceedingly formidable scale, unquote. Within 1 year, Erhard Milch, the Luftwaffe's general field marshal, and Speer had expanded Germany's aircraft production by a phenomenal 50%. Allied intelligence was simply unable to imagine such industry. The Ministry of Economic Warfare established that German fighter production in May 1943 was 765. The true figure was 1,013. The ministry estimated that bomber production in August 1943 was 435. In fact, it was 710. Allied intelligence estimated that German industry was producing about 1,500 planes a month, whereas production was rising steadily from 2,100 to 4,219 in July 1944. The mistake was admitted at the end of 1943. According to the official history, quote, MEW completed the retreat from the expectations that had been harbored in Whitehall during the first 3 years of the war. The blows sustained by Germany in the first half of 1943 had been heavier than in any previous period, but there had been no corresponding deterioration in her power to fight. Despite the air offensive, German industry was breaking previous production records, while civilian food rations were down a mere 10% from pre-war levels. It was the Allied recognition of these achievements that set the scene for the most crucial attack on German scientific resources during the entire war. The target was the Rocket Research Center at Peenemünde. On the night of August 17th, 1943, the whole might of Britain's Bomber Command, 600 aircraft, attacked Peenemünde, thus successfully delaying by months the first arrival of the V-1 Doodlebug rocket over London and averting a catastrophe on the Normandy beaches the following year. Yet, the cabinet approved the raid on Peenemünde only after enormous strife, with opponents arguing that the risk to Britain's only strike force was excessive. In the event, the casualties were indeed heavy, but the root of their opposition was more fundamental. For months, British politicians, scientists, and service and intelligence chiefs had bitterly disagreed among themselves as to whether German scientists had developed a rocket. The scientific experts in the cabinet, led by Churwell, disputed the possibility that Germany could be the source of a new scientific era. These detractors of the German achievement would have been shocked to know that the V-2 had already been successfully launched at Peenemünde on October the 3rd, 1942, and that after Bomber Command's raid, the launches continued from Blizna in Poland. Peenemünde had been bought by the Luftwaffe on the recommendation of General Walter Dornberger and Werner von Braun in 1936. The whole area was effectively sealed off to the outside world while von Braun's team developed a succession of inventions: revolutionary fuel of 75% ethyl alcohol in liquid oxygen, a 1.5-ton thrust motor, and the 40-centimeter cross-section wind tunnel. But at the outbreak of war, the team was still unsuccessful, and Hitler slashed its funds and its priority claim to materials. Despite its fall from favor, von Braun's team continued to work with almost mystic fervor, and deft political opportunism until its first successful launch and 118-mile flight in October 1942. After watching a brilliantly deceptive film of the team's work, Hitler was persuaded to authorize the highest priority for the rocket's mass production. According to Albert Speer, the Führer's previous reluctance had been overcome by a fanatic vision that in a single strike, 5,000 of the one-ton warheads would soon be dropped on Britain. Dribbles of clues about German rocket developments had been arriving in London since the, quote, implausible Oslo report in 1939. These were methodically filed and forgotten. For British intelligence, the early evidence was understandably too tenuous, if only because the Allies had not developed anything similar. Nearly 4 years later, the debate reopened. Two German generals, Wilhelm von Thoma and Ludwig Cruwell, captured in North Africa, were deliberately left in a bugged room. Unwittingly, they revealed their surprise that London had not yet been attacked by the Wonder rockets. Their conversation coincided with the receipt in London in March 1943 of a report from a neutral agent who had visited Peenemünde. Within 3 weeks, the chiefs of staff had recommended to Churchill the appointment of Duncan Sandys to independently analyze the available intelligence. As a trained pilot who had been posted to Britain's rocket research station at Aberforth in North Wales, Sandys was eminently suited for the task, which was codenamed Bodyline. In the absence of reliable intelligence hunters, the chief's nomination of an outsider was an explicit admission that technical intelligence was now too important to be the victim of vested interests. But for Churchill's personal scientific advisor, Lord Churwell, Sandys's appointment was anathema, not only because of Sandys's personal relationship with the Prime Minister, but because Churwell had long been convinced that a large rocket was a technical impossibility. In submitting his strong doubts to Churchill, Churwell was supported by Britain's preeminent rocket expert, Dr. Alwyn Crowe, the controller of projectile development at the Ministry of Supply. Crowe had been appointed by the Committee of Imperial Defense in July 1936 to develop an anti-aircraft rocket. By 1940, he had developed basic but effective short-range 2- and 5-inch rockets powered by solid cordite fuel. He had never considered anything more sophisticated, either in size or design. Any development of his cordite rocket to carry a 1-ton warhead over 100 miles would have been gigantic, weighing at least 70 tons. Even if such a monster could have been launched, both Crow and Churwell dismissed the possibility of inventing satisfactory guidance and stabilizing systems. Churwell conceded that the Germans might well have perfected a small pilotless plane carrying a bomb, but he vastly minimized its powers of destruction and believed the Germans were more likely to have built special guns firing rocket shells. For 3 weeks, Sandys pored over reconnaissance photographs of the Peenemünde site, guided by Churwell and Crow's diktat of the components vital to any successful rocket project, namely, factories to build explosives for solid fuel. Neither British scientists had considered the possibility that von Braun's rocket was powered by liquid fuel, thus dramatically reducing the rocket's weight and requiring totally different production facilities. Misleadingly briefed, Sandys's photo reconnaissance experts were vainly searching for the wrong clues, and at the end of April 1943, Sandys reported, quote, "It is clear that a heavy long-range rocket is not an immediate threat," unquote. Unknown to Sandys, Isaac Lubbock, a modest Shell engineer, and again, Shell, of course, a private corporation. And you see, if you catch the theme of this chapter, it is and look, it started in Germany, right? The private corporations developing the technical advances are far, far more efficient at it than the military is. And so here we go with Shell coming up with a project. Unknown to Sandys, Isaac Lubbock, a modest Shell engineer, was at that time pioneering a very small research project into liquid fuel for rockets. In August 1942, Crow had visited Lubbock's Horsham laboratories and witnessed a successful experiment. But Crow was so wedded to his own solid fuel development that he stubbornly ignored Lubbock's work throughout the following year and simply did not believe that an effective liquid-fueled rocket could be built, since no Allied engineer had designed a pump that could supply the fuel quickly enough to the rocket's combustion chamber. In fact, von Braun's expert, Walter Thiel, had perfected a revolutionary turbopump driven by a gas turbine. During June 1943, Sandys was inundated with apparently confirmatory photographs of increased activity at Peenemünde, as well as intercepts and agents' reports of German rocket developments, including liquid fuels, and most of all, a note from R.V. Jones excuse me. Pardon me. Most importantly, a note from R.V. Jones revealing that Sandys's experts had overlooked a rocket in one of their own reconnaissance photographs taken over Peenemünde. Fearful of the enormous cost that a rocket onslaught on London would cause, Sandys recommended on June 28, 1943, that Peenemünde be destroyed by Bomber Command. Churwell disagreed with Sandys's conclusion, and the two began to compete vigorously for the Prime Minister's support. The following night, senior politicians, service chiefs, and experts met in the underground War Cabinet room off Horse Guards Parade to settle the conflicting evidence. With Churchill in the chair, Churwell resorted to a hoary argument that he had himself contemptuously dismissed in previous disputes. It was impossible, he claimed, to believe that German scientists had so colossally preempted British and American scientists. Churchill then asked Jones to produce his rebuttal. Although the young scientist could still not explain how the rocket was fueled, guided, or stabilized, he produced a torrent of consistent intelligence from divergent sources, which overwhelmingly convinced the Prime Minister. Churchill ordered Peenemünde to be destroyed at the earliest possible moment. Churwell was bruised and crestfallen, although the victors had endorsed his own argument of a decade earlier that the course of any modern war would be determined by the possession and use of scientific advantages. Bomber Command's attack on Peenemünde was a tacit acknowledgement that in the war against Germany, the overwhelming numerical might of the Allies might be neutralized by German scientific developments. Ordered to gamble the entire strength of his forces on the mission, Sir Arthur Harris briefed 4,000 Allied airmen, not just to bomb the factories, but to kill the scientists and engineers. Radar pathfinding equipment was to be used to lead the force to its target, and window was to be used against German radar, together with a deception plan designed to lure the entire strength of the Luftwaffe's night fighter interceptors into combat against an apparent raid over Berlin, 120 miles south. The raid was unprecedented. It was also successful. Although several important buildings escaped and among the important scientists only Walter Thiel was killed, Peenemünde ceased to be the central German research station. Production was slightly delayed while a vast underground assembly factory was under construction at Nordhausen in the Harz Mountains was rapidly completed. By the beginning of November, production of 12,000 V2s had already started, yet both Churwill and Crow still refused to accept that the Germans had succeeded in building a rocket. On August 27, 1943, the SIS completed a review of Sandus's body line intelligence. The most important sources were 159 agent reports, a sketch from a worker in Peenemünde, and a high-grade agent inside the Waffenamt, the Ministry of Armaments in Berlin. The SIS review concluded that the Germans were in fact developing not one but two kinds of rockets. Besides the pure rocket at Peenemünde, there was also a smaller flying bomb or pilotless aircraft, which became known as the V1. Its genesis was remarkable in the light of Hitler's wasted opportunities. At the outbreak of the war, German scientists were developing a new jet engine plane, the Me-262, a rocket aircraft, the Me-163, and the Wasserfall anti-aircraft rocket. All three, however, had become casualties of the savage financial cuts ordered by Hitler in 1940 when he confidently believed that the war would be over before they could be operational. In the meantime, German engineers had incorporated the jets into a flying bomb with a 1-ton warhead, which was designed to be catapulted from ramps into flight. Production of the V1 was authorized after a successful test in December 1942, with the hope that they would be launched from northern France by November 1st, 1943. When Churwell and Crow read the SIS review, they might have been expected to reconsider their views. Combined with photo reconnaissance, POW interrogations, intercepts, and Hitler's own speeches promising the German people that a secret weapon would soon exact revenge for British bombing, the review should have been sufficient to convince them that German scientists were more advanced, and their last lingering doubts should surely have disappeared in early October when Lubbock's assistant, Godfrey Gollin, described in detail the feasibility of a liquid fuel rocket. In a series of heated meetings throughout the month, Crow and Churwell found themselves gradually isolated, but Crow nevertheless ruthlessly dismissed all the evidence. Quote, "We are of the opinion that the possibility of such a rocket development in Germany can be ruled out," unquote. Toward the end of October, Lubbock hurriedly returned from America to reveal that American engineers had recently designed the all-important gas turbine pump. At a tense meeting, Crow sourly ignored the news and, with equal self-assurance, dismissed the most recent photo reconnaissance photos of the Peenemünde rockets as inflated barrage balloons. For a moment there was silence. Then Colonel Kenneth Post, Sandus's assistant, asked the government specialist why balloons would be transported on heavy rail wagons. Crow was left speechless. On October 25th, Churchill chaired a defense committee meeting to consider all the new evidence, especially Lubbock's rapidly drawn but accurate sketch of the possible German rocket. The verbal, intellectual, and personal clash between Cherwell and Lubbock was vitriolic and ruthless. The shocked shell scientist was castigated by the professor as a third-rate engineer meddling in a mare's nest. 3 days later, in Downing Street, the Prime Minister finally sided with Lubbock. But within 3 days, frustrated by his own scientific limitations and baffled by the problem of launching a long-range rocket by any method other than from a tube, Crow publicly attacked Lubbock, again insisting that the alleged rocket was technically impossible. In unison, Crow and Cherwell exploited the confusion between the photographic evidence of the ski ramps being built on the French coast for the V-1s and the alleged launch sites for the V-2 rockets located in Peenemünde. Neither could accept that German scientists had developed two rockets. The V-1 was, both argued, too small to be dangerous, and both drew comfort from the absence of rocket attacks against Britain. The dispute was temporarily calmed on November 15th when the bodyline investigation was replaced by Crossbow, a more intensive joint intelligence committee investigation into all of Germany's long-range weapons. Until December 1943, the unresolved argument was strictly contained within the British cabinet. Unwilling to expose their confusion and disagreements, the British only decided to share their dilemma with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington once the existence of the V-1 was irrefutably confirmed by photographs of the ramps in France. The threat had now become imminent, and American help was needed. Until the British disclosure, Vannevar Bush and other American scientists had also doubted the feasibility of launching a rocket carrying a 1-ton warhead and believed that the secret German threat was bacterial and germ warfare, possibly delivered by a rocket. Well, I think that's a good place to stop. We are now getting, of course, from our weapons of immediate destruction on the battlefield to weapons of a more subtle and insidious type, bacterial and germ warfare, possibly delivered by rocket. Okay, so that's as far as we're going to get today. We're leaving off on page 64 of Tom Bauer's The Paperclip Conspiracy, The Hunt for the Nazi Scientists. And there's a lot of background here that I think is really going to help us as we get into the later chapters. So thanks for being with me, and I will be with you again tomorrow morning, 11 a.m. Eastern Time, with the great Hrvoje Moric of Geopolitics and Empire for a monthly review that he has graciously agreed to do with me. So that will be very, very interesting.